And the third lecture in honor of Mahesh Buch, who I knew as an officer of the Indian Civil Service and as a friend, and I was a great, great admirer of him. So I'm very grateful to the National Centre for Human Settlements and the Environment Friends for inviting me here today. It is, as I said, a great honour. I've once before spoken on the subject I'm going to speak on now, and that was in Almora. And I had the temerity to make that speech in Hindi. And I was looking over it to remind myself of things to say before I left. And I thought to myself, well, I will not go to Bhopal and inflict my Hindi on them. This is a subject which for me personally has always been very important, the subject basically of governance in this country, because I profoundly believe that one of the things which has held India back is lack of good governance. And I think it's an appropriate subject to talk about when talking in honor of Mahesh, because of course he was himself an exemplary civil servant who was also greatly concerned about the state of governance in this country. And I remember one occasion with Mahesh when he told me a lovely story about governance and his views on it. He was, as you know, a great town planner. And Rajiv Gandhi used to have breakfasts at which he would ask experts to come and he would have conversations with them and try and pick their brains. And they were discussing the need to build upwards in India. And Rajiv said he thought this was the only answer. So Mahesh said, well, you know, sir, if you do that, you'll just end up with a lot of rubbish and garbage between the buildings. So Rajiv Gandhi said, oh, I don't think that's necessary. I've just been in Singapore, and there this doesn't happen. And Mahesh, without thinking, found himself saying, yes, sir, but in Singapore they have a government. I think that is, in a way, an example of Mahesh's views of government in this country in some ways. But equally, he was not a man who was a cynic. He was not a man who would say that all is hopeless and all is rotten. And I want to stress that what I'm going to say today is critical, yes. But it doesn't mean I'm saying it is rotten, that India has no achievement, that there's nothing valid about governance in this country. What I'm saying, I hope, is middle of the road and balanced, which is what we meant to be in the BBC. And one of the biggest problems, I think, with governance, which people always talk about, again brings me back to Mahesh, and that is this problem of interference by politicians in the workings of the civil service. Now, I want to go much broader than this, but it reminds me of another story about Mahesh, which I've heard. And that was, of course, that he actually resigned because he was transferred for refusing a bribe. And of course, it was a politician who transferred him. So he was acutely aware and very strongly opposed, really, to the excessive interference in the working of government by the politicians. And one last story I heard this morning that I must just tell you, because I think it's a wonderful story. When Rajiv Gandhi said, I want you to become governor of Punjab, but Mahesh's response to that was, well, that wouldn't be a good idea for you, sir, because the first person I would arrest would be Bhuta Singh, who probably remember was a rather senior gentleman. So we set out then on this voyage to talk a bit about governance in memory of a wonderful civil servant. Now, sometimes, as I said, I get the strong impression that people writing about India and Indians themselves think nothing has been achieved in the last 70 years, or very little has been achieved. But of course that is nonsense. When you look back in history, you realize that at the time of independence, China and India were two of the poorest countries in the world. Well, now neither of them are. And when you look at the figures, and I don't want to reel off a lot of figures, but when we look at figures for literacy, for people lifted above poverty line, for mortality rates and everything, you have to do a bit of maths to get those figures right. You have to realize that the figures for, at the time of partition, was I think about 350 million. Whereas now, you are talking over 1 billion. So the huge increase in literacy which has taken place since partition, for instance, is a reflection of a very, very large number of people lifted out of poverty or made literate or whatever it is. It's not a linear calculation. You're not just saying that from 11% literate, I think it was, to roughly 70%, that's all it is. It's 70% multiplied by the increase in population. And that is a very big achievement indeed. And the other thing, of course, is a very big achievement, is the fact that India has remained a democracy. There is no real other example of a major developing country like India, which has managed to remain a democracy for all but 18 months of its time. And that again is a huge achievement. And looking again at the question of administration and government and civil service, obviously these institutions have played a major role in preserving democracy, particularly, I think, the role of the armed forces. Because if you didn't have an apolitical armed forces, and if they hadn't remained apolitical, not involved in politics, they would almost certainly have, I like this Hindi word very much, daklandaz in politics. You just have to look around South Asia. I've spent a lot of time in Pakistan under the iron rule of General Zia-ul-Haq. I've been in Bangladesh with about 5 different military rulers that have been there. And in Pakistan now, I don't want to run Pakistan down, but one of the acute problems every thinking Pakistani will tell me is the army's involvement in politics. The Indian army has never shown any inclination or indication. And that is, if you think about it, an institutional triumph. And the other thing is that for all the criticisms of the civil service and everything else, they have run elections, they have run the country, they have maintained a reasonable, smooth progress democratically. Now this brings me to the next point I wanted to make, which is that India is often compared with China. As I said at the start, the 2 poorest countries when they started out at the time of independence. But again, what people forget is the enormous achievement India has of growing peacefully, growing steadily. China has been through the most hideous periods in its history in order to grow. The Great Leap Forward and the other periods like that in its history. most appalling barbarities were committed then. Terrible insecurity, terrible tyranny virtually in those days. Look now at China, bitterly regretting its one-child policy. India, you might say, hasn't done enough about controlling the size of families, but look at China now, the mess it's in population terms. So again, India has progressed, perhaps less slowly than China, but I would argue in a more stable and in a more humane and in a more peaceful manner as well. Years ago, I remember reading Amartya Sen's book, in which he said that India had not had any famines since independence. They had plenty in the days of the British, sadly, and he said that this was, of course, because of democracy, because in a democracy, politicians couldn't allow famine. So India has been, as I said, maintained by these government institutions and everything, which I'm now going to be a little bit critical about. I think the first thing I would like to say in criticism of the government system is that it is not really able to deliver. In a sense, all its organizations, all its institutions don't function well enough to achieve the whole of their objective. And it was once said, put very beautifully by a World Bank economist who said, India is not a failing country, but a flailing country. And that means India is flailing around, trying to do things, but not really succeeding, because the institutions are not strong to do it. Living in Delhi, I see this before my very eyes. I see the Delhi traffic police flailing as they try, literally, their arms going everywhere, as they try to control the traffic in Delhi. And for all their efforts, what do I see every day? People riding two-wheelers, shooting across lights, people riding two-wheelers without any helmets on, people driving cars and again shooting across lights, going down the road the wrong way, and all the rest of it. So that's just one example of the administration's inability to carry things through. And this weakness in delivery, of course, is at the heart, really, of many of the problems of this country. I think when we look back in history and when we look back at India today, we might come to think that one of the reasons for this flailing, one of the reasons for the ineffectiveness of the institutions is because actually these are colonial institutions. They are not institutions founded for India, for Indian needs. If you think of it, a colonial police force is a police force which is designed purely for law and order. It is basically a civil arm of a civil form of the army, basically. Whereas in a democracy, a police force is meant to serve the people, and a police force also is meant to assist the government in development rather than just in law and order. And there's a friend of mine from the city of Bhopal who is a very eminent police officer, and he put it very well to me. He said there are two types of police forces, one governing and one serving. And India is left with a governing police force rather than a serving police force. And the whole system of the Raj continues in a way in the administration of this country. You still have the collector. Now, the collector was primarily a revenue officer. But today, someone was saying to me, I think the figure they gave was the collector who now sits on 70 different committees in the district. Because why? Because the responsibilities of the collector have expanded, but the form of office has not changed. And no reform really has taken place in the system of government at the local level. In land, you still have the British Raj officials, the Tehsildar and the others land officials, the British Raj type of officials. You have also the British Raj system still of hierarchy, very, very hierarchical services. And I always think that a measure of the hierarchy of a service is the number of times that you hear the word sir. If there is a lot of sirring going on, then it's obvious it is a hierarchical organisation. And again, that is an old-fashioned British Raj style of institution. So that is one of the main problems you have. There was one excellent report drawn up on police reform by the junta government in 1977. And that reform was handed over to the next government, Indira Gandhi's government, and nothing was done to implement that reform. This is the problem. I don't think that this, any government, including this government, has taken this problem of administrative reform seriously. And why have they not done? Well, you have to be suspicious about this. After all, the present system has worked very well for the politicians. So would they want to change a system which works very well for them? So really it's up to you, the people, to demand this. If the politicians thought that there really were votes in improving governance and the people really were demanding it, then they would be forced to do something about it. But as long as everyone sits back and says, Tikai chal tahai chal nedo, and all the rest of it, then you're not going to get any change. So it's up to you, the people, to say, we don't want to go on with this present system until we've got it reformed. As I said, one of the main problems is political interference. And why does political interference take place? Because the politicians are able to do it. Because you, in a sense, allow them to do it. And this brings me then to the question of a fundamental flaw. And that is this, that as the years have gone by, the autonomy of all the institutions has decreased. All the institutions are subject to interference. And all of them, instead of sticking up for their rights, fail to do so on the whole and allow this interference to take place. And democracy is really like a stool. You have 3 or 4 legs, depending on the number you want to count. But you have a parliament, you have a judiciary, you have a civil service, you have a press. If all the legs are not equal size, then your stool becomes unbalanced. And it's a great myth, a misunderstanding of the Constitution, in my belief, to think, as some people do, that Parliament is all-powerful and therefore politicians are all-powerful. They are one of the legs of a stool. And it's getting this balance back again, getting this sense of everyone, all these institutions having their rightful place and being allowed to fulfill that place and to do as they're expected to. Even the judiciary, I think, is unbalanced. Yesterday only I heard a senior civil servant, retired civil servant, talking about judicial arrogance. And he made a very good point to me. He said that the judges are the best protected of all the people in this country, and certainly all the members of the administration in the broadest sense. After all, a civil servant can be sacked, a policeman can be sacked, a politician can be thrown out by his voters, but a judge can only be removed by impeachment. And yet, we all know of cases of corruption in the judiciary, but we all know also of cases where the judiciary exceeds its role and starts acting as a government, telling the government what to do, rather than acting as the legal arm and protecting the Constitution in that way. There was an old, I remember from my university days, an old Latin quip about the judges, which was quis custodiet ipsos custodes, who will guard the guardians themselves. And that is true of the judges, who will guard the judges themselves, because what they say is final, and they are protected. And yet they too need to consider their role and whether they're exceeding their role. And they too need to consider how they deal with the problem of dishonesty in their ranks. The police, of course, are notorious for political interference, of suffering from it. And what we saw in Panchkula was a clear and blatant example of this. All those people shouldn't have been allowed to gather there. They wouldn't have been if the police had been allowed to act as they professionally would want to have acted. But they couldn't. They got political instructions instead, and so you had the mayhem. And writing about this afterwards, one of India's most outstanding police officers, Julio Ribeiro, said, "There was a time when politicians were wary of expecting senior police officers to blindly toe their line, irrespective of the moral, ethical, and more importantly, legal merits of their instructions, communicated directly or through trusted intermediaries. This is not the situation today. Politicians of all parties and ideologies treat the bureaucracy and the police as private fiefdoms that will have to bow to their wishes as and when demanded." That neatly sums up the whole real problem of this problem of political interference. Now, what then is the condition of the institutions of India today as a result of these weaknesses, particularly the British Raj inheritance and the whole question of political interference and lack of autonomy for the institutions? Well, Emin Vora is a very famous civil servant. He's still the governor of Punjab. And last year he wrote a book called Safeguarding India. And in it he said, India could face chaos, turbulence, and serious unrest unless public administration systems become more efficient, responsive, productive, honest, and accountable. And talking of the state of the All India services, he described it as politicized, communalized, and exploited. Well, those are very strong words, but they don't come from me. They come from a very senior and respected civil servant. There's one other aspect I want to talk about, which I feel very strongly about, which is in a way different. When we consider the problems of the civil servants, we tend to consider the problems of the senior services, as indeed M.N. Voda did in his book. But I have always been very depressed by the way the government meets with ordinary people, the face-to-face contact of the government. And many people really live privileged lives and barely have to put up with this. But if you see the way a block development officer is quite likely to talk to a poor person, if you see the way that Tehsildar will talk to a poor farmer who's worried because someone's trying to take his land off him. It's very succinctly summed up for me once when in a village in Rajasthan I found an old man who didn't have a below poverty line card. And I said to him, well, why didn't you go to the BDO and ask him for a below poverty line card? And he said, because wo mujhe kya bolega, wo bolega bago, bago, bago. And that was what he thought would be the interface between him and the government, which is meant to be his government. And I think this business of being rulers, as the British Raj were, has really infected the lower level of the government when the British were there, and it remains still. They behave at the lower level as though no one had a right really to ask them for anything, and it was their right to decide whether they would bother or whether they will bother to do anything about it. It's almost like the famous phrase which we had when I was in the army as a young man. They're almost as though they were saying, it was a rude word which I won't say, but to hell with you, Jack, I'm aboard. I'm all right, I've got a job for life, I've got this status and all the rest of it, and to hell with you. And this really, I think, is a very, very depressing, because it's unsightly, but it's worse than that. It's really a denial of the government's duty to serve the people. And the last thing, perhaps, is the inefficiency which comes about because of the failure of the weakness of the institutions. And I think you're seeing two demonstrations of that inefficiency right now. If you take the question of demonetization, I'm not going to argue about the economics of it because I'm not an economist. But I can tell you, and you all know perfectly well, that it was executed very inefficiently and damaged a lot of people. And poorer people some of them have been put out of business because of this. And now we're seeing another example of inefficiency in the implementation of the sales tax. Again, with the people, the main sufferers being the bottom of the pile. And of course, I'm not saying this government is particularly inefficient, but I just quote these two examples of it to show the problem that the government has of doing anything efficiently. The failure to deliver, which results as a result of this inefficiency, was of course illustrated by the oft-quoted remark of Rajiv Gandhi that if I want to give 1 rupee to a village, I can only actually get 10 paisa there. And that brings me very briefly to the problem of corruption. I don't want to touch on corruption too much because sometimes people think that corruption is the only problem this country faces. I believe that corruption is a symptom of bad governance rather than a cause in its own. I believe once governance is improved, corruption will automatically decrease. But corruption does lead me on to what is happening now, which is we seem to be living in an era now when the government believes that, all right, we don't need to bother with reforms or anything like that, because everything is going to be solved digitally or electronically. And in a way, it sounds a wonderful idea. After all, if digital banking really works wonderfully well, then a bank clerk can't take a cut out of a loan which he gives to a poor farmer. A government public distribution food store can't steal rice or wheat from poor people because they're getting their food ration in the form of money. All these, there's so many things which sound very attractive about electronic and digital delivery. But the fact, as a outstanding Indian economist said, Ashoka Modi, technology without new institutions would never renew waste, technology without new institutions will never deliver core education, health and public services. Will never deliver core health, education and public services. So it's like building a house, You think, well, if you started building the house without making sure it stood on something firmly, without worrying about the foundations, no matter how beautiful the house is, the house wouldn't last long. In the same way, I'm sure that Ashoka Modi is right. You cannot just sit back and say, oh, Tika, we'll have all this electronic stuff, we'll have all this digital banking, people will have Kisan credit cards, and all the rest of it. And I had a classic example, actually, of how difficult it could be for these things that work. The other day, 4 or 5 months ago, I was sitting in a little shop near where I live in Nizamuddin. This shop was in the Basti. And there was a man, the shopkeeper there. He had my hand, and he was rubbing my hand in his hair. Now you might say it's a very strange thing to do, rub my hand in his hair. But why was he doing it? Because we were trying and trying and trying to get my fingerprints to make an impression so that I could get an Aadhaar card. And literally, after 15, 20 minutes of this tamasha, one only appeared on the thing. And I thought to myself, when about a month or so after that, I tried this Aadhaar card because to get a telephone number, I needed to use it. And we tried and tried and tried. And again, within almost exactly the same time, eventually, a faint image disappeared. And that was when I thought to myself, take a lady who needs to have an Aadhaar card, an old lady, to get her rations from a ration shop in a remote village. And you think the dukandar, the shopkeeper, is going to be for 16 minutes trying to help her fingerprint come up? No. First time it doesn't come up, he says, "Kam nahi karta, chala jao." And that's true, that will happen. Because the man who very helpfully eventually got my impression in says it happens with almost all old people. that because we're old, we've worn our fingers out. Now that's just one example, you see. This technology is never going to be perfect. That's another problem with it. And, you know, Vora in his book says he thinks one of the reasons why we haven't bothered about administrative reforms is because everyone has been seduced by the economic reforms and the economic progress India has made. And I would suggest we all need to seriously think that we're not in danger of being seduced by the idea of an electronic or digital revolution. And we got to go back and think about the problem of these institutions. Now, I want to just tell you two stories to perhaps examples of the way our bureaucracy works and its interface with the public. And both concern me, and both concern a bureaucracy in this country which I dearly love, which is Indian Railways. And if ever there was a bureaucracy in this country which is still run as the British ran it, it is Bharatiya Rail. But I still love it dearly. Well, these two things happened to me. Once I was on a train from Chandigarh to Kalka, and I had paid a super fast surcharge. And when I was at the ticketing, the examiner came round, I said to him, what a theek hai, surcharge theek hai, express gare ke liye, fast gare ke liye, lekin ye gare bahut dhiri chalta hai. And he said to me in English, he said to me, no, no, sir, this is a fast train. It's only going slow. And that to me is an example of a typical bureaucratic example of a petty bureaucrat to whom what is written in the book is all that matters. To hell with what's happening on the ground. And the second one happened on Mughalsarai station when I was going on a long and complicated journey from Patna to Bangalore for one of my best friend's weddings. And I had to change at Mughalsarai Junction for the first change. And there was no sign of my train. So I went to the Jankari office, or whatever they called it, and there was a very sort of tired and bored young man there. And I said to him, what has happened to this train? It was actually only the train going from Mughalsarai to Varanasi, where I had to change again. And he said, looked at some paper or something, he said, indefinitely delayed. So I said, इसमें क्या मतलब है indefinitely delayed? मतलब है कि गाड़ी गायब हो गया? And he said, हाँ, तो हो सकता है कि गायब हो गया, पता नहीं. And then, of course, I got very, very angry indeed, and so got a very red face and behaved like the worst form of Angrez Raj relic, which you know I am. And he just looked at me scornful and he said, आप लोग तो क्या करेंगे? आप लोग तो हिंदुस्तान नहीं समझता है, India नहीं समझता. And I said, क्या मतलब है? What are you talking about? You know? And he said to me, साहब ऐसा है, आप आराम से. एक दूसरी गाड़ी है, वो गायब थी, लेकिन अब हमको मालूम है कि वो कहाँ है. So the train was lost, but now we'd found it, and you can go on that one. And so again, that was an example of what many people think is the basis of what India works on, jugaad. So those two examples will perhaps lead you with an impression of that we're not so often talked about failure of the Indian administration to intervene, to face humanely with its public. But We, as I said at the start, are talking in honour of a great civil servant. We're talking in honour of the many civil servants who do their utmost to help India to do their job, basically. Mahesh wrote a book called When the Harvest Moon is Blue. And the book was described as a book of optimism, of hope and rejoicing at the wonders of India. So all I would say is I don't think India or Indians should despair. I think they should get on the job, with the job of realizing the potential of this wonderful and beautiful India. Thank you all very much.